Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our Bible study in Luke chapter 7. Hope everyone had a good Christmas. It is the 27th of December today, and I'm sure that many of you did, and I wish you a happy new year. I've mentioned in a previous video about a Bible reading plan that we might do through 2022, but I've kind of run into some copyright issues with reading the English Standard Version. I could probably go and do a King James version study, but I'm just not sure that I want to do King James. I grew up on King James. I love the King James, but I also know it's not the easiest translation in the world. So as of now, we're not going to do the yearly Bible reading plan, but I do have a contact at Crossway who holds the publishing rights for the English Standard, and if I might reach out to them and ask, and I will let you know if there are any updates to that. But in today's study, we're going to begin in verse 24. And if you'd like the notes for this study, there are links down in the description below where you can get the same notes that I'm reading out of. So let's read verses 24 through 27. And just remember for context here, I know it's been a long Christmas break. Many cookies have been consumed. So if you don't remember where we just were, I don't blame you. But John the Baptist, he had just sent some disciples to Jesus to ask if Jesus was the Messiah or if they should be looking for somebody else. So that's the context where we're picking up. Verse 24, when John's messengers had gone, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who are dressed in splendid clothing and live in luxury are in king's courts. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. So when the disciples of John had turned away, Jesus turned to the crowd that had probably overheard some of what he was talking to John's disciples about. And he asked those people, many of which had been a part of John's ministry or had gone out into the wilderness to listen to John preach. He asked them, what did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? Now, what exactly does that mean? The answer that Jesus would give is no, that isn't what you went out to see, but we have to figure out what exactly he means by a reed shaken in the wind. If you've ever been to a marsh or you've been to a field with tall grass or reeds in it, you'll know that when strong winds come, you'll see that tall grass and those reeds kind of bend over to the will of the wind. The pressure of the wind is pushing on them in some direction. A lot of times they bend over because it's just easier to give into that pressure and go with the flow than it is to fight against it and to stand upright and to resist its force. So I think what Jesus is saying here is, you didn't go out into the wilderness to see some man who was shaken by the wind and the pressures of the culture that surrounded him. John wasn't a fickle man who shifted to appease the ever-changing pressures of first century pop culture. He was God's man carrying a timeless message. Later in Paul's epistle in the book of Ephesians, he encourages the Christians not to be pushed around by every wind of doctrine. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14, so that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness in deceitful schemes. So he's saying to the people here, you didn't go out in the wilderness to see some fickle guy. And I bet John really appreciated Jesus saying this, because maybe some of the people who had heard the question that was asked by John's disciples, maybe they were beginning to think, well, maybe John isn't confident about what he was preaching about. Maybe we weren't right to listen to him after all. And, maybe he's changing his position now. And Jesus says to them, no, that's not the case. That's not the way that he wanted them viewing John the Baptist and his convictions and his faith. He says, John was a man who was firm against the pressures of his society. He was going to teach God's message no matter what. That's who you went out to see. He's going to go on and talk about John some more in his ministry. But an application, I thought, from this particular text, and that is that, a moment of doubt or a momentary weakness of a person's faith does not define them. We shouldn't judge a person's character on one mistake or one singular falter that they have, or some day when their faith is a little bit weaker than another day, because that may have been what was happening here with John. And Jesus didn't present John as a reed shaken in the wind just because he had a doubt. He still holds him up and speaks highly of the faith and the ministry that he had. He then says, did you go out into the wilderness to see a man who was dressed in soft clothing? And the answer is no, you didn't. This one's a little bit easier to understand, talking about a man who lived in comfort and in luxury and whose ministry brought him ease of life. Is that who you went out to see? No, certainly not. They went out in the wilderness to see a man who had endured the hardships of a lot of the Old Testament prophets. The prophets had taught an unpopular message, and they, like John, were not reeds shaken in the wind, and they certainly didn't live an easy life because of the message that they proclaimed, but they remained steadfast in preaching that message. All that the prophets had foretold had come to pass or would come to pass, and here Jesus affirmed the words and the work of John by elevating him above the other prophets, and you see that in verse 26. So he says, what then did you go out to see? It's not a reed shaken in the wind. It's not a man who's in soft clothing living in luxury. He says, you went out to see a prophet, true to the nature of the Old Testament prophets, and more than a prophet, Jesus says. Well, in what sense was John more than a prophet? A prophet is just any individual who carries a message from God to the people and communicates it to them. John was more than just one of the other prophets in the sense that he was unique. He had a role to play that nobody else played throughout all of human history. His ministry was to prepare the way for the Messiah, and that wasn't anybody else's responsibility. That was his. And Jesus speaks of it here as if it was a very, very high honor to be in this role. Talking about John, Jesus quoted this prophecy in Malachi chapter 3 verse 1 and Malachi chapter 4 verse 5, and says that these prophecies were about John the Baptist and about his ministry, and this is what makes him so special. Malachi chapter 3 verse 1 talks about the messenger who the Lord would use to prepare the way before him. And then Malachi chapter 4 verse 5, behold, I send you Elijah the prophet before the great and the awesome day of the Lord comes. John came in the spirit and the power of Elijah, and so that was the reference to him. Jesus kind of doubles down on this, and in verse 28, he says, I tell you, among those born of women, none is greater than John, yet the one who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. It says, of all the men born in the world, no one's greater than John. But the one who's least in the kingdom of God, simple way, I guess, to think about that is just Christians, those who submit to God as their king and live under his rule, right? So Christians, those who are the least in the kingdom of God is greater than John. Now that can be kind of a confusing statement. We have, I guess, two things to kind of look at there. And the first one is, why is John greater than anyone who came before him? Why is he the greatest born of women? And in the second case, why are we as Christians, as disciples, why are we greater than John? So let's try to work on that. So it's my understanding that John was not the greatest servant of God because he was less sinful than anyone else, or he was more steadfast than anyone else, or he performed more good works than anybody else. That wasn't why Jesus was saying this about him. The reason Jesus was saying this was about him was because of his elevated role, because of the role that God had put him in. The Jews had been waiting for the Messiah for centuries. And John was selected among the billions of people who have walked the earth. John was selected to be in the position of the herald for the king. So that's why, because of what God made of him, not necessarily because of what he did. He was the greatest. So when we think about then, why is it that disciples, those in the kingdom of God, are greater than John? Even the lowliest Christian is greater than the kingdom of, or even the lowliest of Christians is said to be greater than John. Why is that? Well, I think in a similar way, it's not because those who are privileged to be part of the kingdom of God are less sinful than John, or more steadfast than John, or do more good works than John, but it's just that. It's a privilege. It's because of the privilege that we've been given, because we have been honored by receiving association with the Son of God in a way that John never could, because John lived pre-death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And so it's not because of our own goodness, but it's because of the privilege that we enjoy because of Jesus. So that's the way that I understand that. All right, well, in the next couple verses, we'll pick up in verse 29 for the next video. Until next time, have a fantastic day.